What do you get when slavery ends and you're promised 40 acres and a mule? Not shit. Reparations. Democrats love to pander with it, black people love to dream about it, and Republicans love to avoid it altogether so they don't look racist. But what even are reparations really? 200 years after slavery, should the government make good on their promise? And if they did make good, would it even be economically feasible? Shortly before the Civil War ended, Union General William Sherman promised freed blacks the infamous 40 acres and a mule, which almost came to be. Many freed slaves heard this and took the initiative to acquire land plots. But then Lincoln died, and Andrew Johnson took his place, and, well, let's just say AJ wasn't for the gang. So he broke the promise literally immediately, and leaving black people to basically rot. Ever since then, most African Americans have been wanting some type of compensation for slavery and convict leasing and sharecropping and redlining and Jim Crow and all of the other garden variety racism we've had to shoulder since day one. But because it's taken so long for it to actually become a serious conversation, many conservatives think it's too late. So basically, when the idea of reparations was at peak relevancy, everyone was too racist to care. And now that people aren't allowed to be racist anymore, they're just like, oh, well, it was too long ago. There are real concerns for reparations, though. Is it economically feasible? How would it be done in the first place? Some say it could be done by taxing the ultra-wealthy, who just so happen to be ultra-white. Others suggest covering college tuition and student loans for descendants of slaves. But the prevailing argument is for some sort of cash repayment in the form of trust funds, bonds, or a straight check. And yes, a blanket of money won't just magically fix all of the systematic racism in America, and white people would definitely act like they solve racism, but even with the concerns, reparations are not a radical idea. In 1988, the US government issued the Civil Liberties Act and authorized a payment of $20,000 to each internment camp survivor. Similarly, Germany has paid more than $70 billion in reparations through various programs to the Jewish community and continues to deliver hundreds of millions annually. But of course, in America, there is a stark racial divide on this issue, with only 15% of white Americans thinking reparations should be given out to the descendants of slavery, compared to the 58% of African Americans. The present-day value of 40 acres and a mule is calculated to be about $80,000. This money could have been passed down through generations and grown to create generational wealth. We know how important generational wealth is, because that's exactly what the descendants of slave-owning white people and the people who worked with slave-owning white people have today. 51% of whites, however, have deluded themselves into believing that the impact of slavery isn't at all factored in terms of average wealth levels for black and whites in the US today, even though there is a clear discrepancy in the wealth gap between black and white families. Make it make sense? All in all, this is a very layered issue. But whether or not reparations are feasible or an adequate apology for slavery, with the economic divide and ramifications of slavery, it is clear something obviously must be done. As Ta-Nehisi Coates puts it, until we reckon with our compounding moral debts, America will never be whole.
What's up, guys?
Welcome to Culture Talk.
We are your hosts, Cody and Destiny, and I don't really know Destiny. I'm not really feeling the whole reparations thing. I kind of feel like white people are just gonna be like, oh, we solved racism, you know? Okay, so Cody, you feel like they're gonna treat us like how they treated Obama.
Oh, BCRIPs, you dig?
But what if, hear me out, what if reparations have a positive impact on our community?
I've seen a lot of cap in my day, and the numbers are starting adding up, but I guess we'll just have to see how the culture feels about it.
All right, let's go.
Do you think that the federal government should make good on their promises of reparations?
Yeah, Yeah, definitely. I think reparations is a good start to just starting to sort of heal all of the wounds that were created by slavery. I know it was a long time ago, but we're still suffering from it, so yeah.
I do. There have been a lot of promises made, I think, since the founding of this country, and a lot of promises that have been broken. And I think it's high time that the federal government owned up to its promises and made good.
I mean, I certainly think that a conversation needs to have and it needs to be had. And obviously, I like the idea. I think it's incredibly hard and complicated topic. But I think the government needs to actually take the problem seriously. Absolutely.
I think that, for the first step to healing is recognizing that, reparations never happened really, and that Black people in America are still suffering, still underrepresented, still hurting, and it hasn't really been taken seriously, kind of what Sam said. So I think that one step towards that is recognizing, yes, there is all these things, and here's how we can actually implement equity in our society.
Okay, so in modern times, what do you think reparations would look like?
That's an interesting question.
I know that the wealth gap, the racial wealth gap specifically, is something that has been caused by structural racism, so maybe addressing that through housing policy or just wealth building policy in general. But I know that there's the bill in Congress every year to study it, and it's it needs to be studied more. I don't really know the answer, but I think the wealth gap is a good place to start.
I think that's a really tricky question, and it's not going to be just in terms of money. I think that it's a system level issue, and we need to be doing something in terms of housing, in terms of education, and that it needs to start from the ground up, because there are many communities that have fallen behind, and that it should be the government's problem to come in and fix it at a system level.
I think it could look like guaranteed money for vocational and college for all children of color. I think it could look like vouchers for affordable living in cities such as Washington, D.C. And I think it could look like money put into programs so that racism and sexism would be abolished.
So it seems like we're getting a lot of positive reviews on reparations.
Especially from the white people. I really thought, low-key, they was going to be against it, but who knows, maybe the times are changing.
Okay, but now that we've discussed that we are in favor of reparations, what would that even look like in 2020?
I'm not entirely sure, so let's throw it to our panelists for clarification.
And we'll see you guys next time on Culture Talk. It's Black History Month, and while we are celebrating and all of that good stuff, I'm just wondering, where are the reparations? Who is gonna run me my money? I'm broke. So today, we're getting into it. Do you all think we should get reparations, and should the federal government make good on their promise of reparations?
So I think the conversation is a little bit more nuanced than what a lot of people often kind of prescribe to it. I think it's hard to argue against whether or not we should get reparations, but I think it's easy to gloss over the mechanisms of how in the world this would happen. Who gets the reparations? How do we identify these people? How much money we're gonna give people? I could list a million questions. So I think it's important to also talk about those things. But I think at the most basic level, yes, descendant of enslaved African-American people deserve reparations.
I agree with that statement. Descendants of African-American people should receive reparations. But I feel like it's gonna be so hard to track who is and who is not a descendant of African-Americans, because all people of color and all people that are Black people aren't necessarily descendants of people who were actually slaves.
And I think while you guys bring up valid points, I think we also have to realize that this isn't something that's new to this country. The U.S. has given reparations to people 4 times. Broadly in the world, it's happened 2 other times. And within those 4 times, most recently in 1988, when descendants of people who were affected by Japanese internment, over 80,000 people got reparations. And so I believe that if the U.S. could figure out how to distribute that amount of money to Japanese Americans, and when they did it in 1920 to Hawaiian Americans, and when they did it again during the Tuskegee experiment, I think it's worth us actually investing and answering those questions. And so I think while it is nuanced, we don't just stop there. We, do the study, and then we actually talk about, so what do those solutions look like?
I just quickly have to say, I understand your point, but I also think it's important to note that there are many more black people or descendant of enslaved black people currently alive than 80,000. Like the scope of this project would be like unheard of. Although we've done similar things in the past as a country, I think it's important to note that this will be much more complex, much more intricate. Not to say that it's impossible, but I think it is a false kind of equivocation to say, oh, we've done it before, it's easily something we can do again.
And my point wasn't, and obviously there's more than 80,000 black people and descendants of slaves, but I think my point was to say that because we've already when we did this in 1980, 80,000 was a lot of people, and we didn't know how we were going to do that. And so what I'm saying is that if we were able to figure it out then, that we have the potential to figure out now. Obviously, the scope is much larger, but I don't think we've given really any real reasons why, and you've admitted yourself that it's not impossible. And so I think we actually need to take the time and resources to actually go back and look at the ancestry. I mean, individual people find out their ancestry all the time. And so I just don't think it's unrealistic to say that we could find out for the majority of descendants of slaves here in America today.
I think that we should consider public opinion. So 68% of residents nationally do not think that the United States should pay reparations to descendants of slaves.
Well, here's where this conversation becomes complex. We're talking about people who are descendant of slaves. We're talking about paying people. Checks is what I'm getting. So hold on. First of all, what are reparations for? Reparations are for slavery, right? We have created an entire culture in the United States of America based on slavery. It doesn't matter if you're a descendant of American slaves. My parents came from the Bahamas, right? And they're black. If a police officer stops them, they're not gonna ask them, are you a descendant of slaves, right? And the way that black people are treated in this country, it's not because of whether you are a slave or not. It's a culture that has been cultivated over centuries, right? So the things that have resulted from slavery, it's not just generational poverty. There's people who have been put into prison. There's over 1 million people, or nearly 1 million African Americans, black Americans in this country today who are mass incarcerated. It doesn't matter where they came from. It doesn't matter if they're descendants of slaves. Reparations can deal with that.
Sure, but I mean, if we're using your same rationale, then, you know, the system of slavery led to the creation of the police. Police were created to track down slaves. Over-policing created mass incarceration. So regardless of whether you're white or black, if you're a white person and you have been negatively impacted by mass incarceration, should we give them reparations because the roots are tied to slavery?
I think the comparison there, now that's an actual false equivocation. I mean, to say that because white people are somehow, and I'm just giving you, and I don't even see the connection here, that they're somehow, you know, obviously they're affected by mass incarceration, but there's not a systemic history. I mean, the institution of incarceration wasn't created because of them. So there's a difference between something systemically and intentionally happening, and then white people just being just unintentionally affected by the institution that was directly created to harm black and brown people.
Sure.
And hold on. I don't think we should go down the path thinking that because black people receive reparations in this country, it's somehow going to harm white Americans. If black people receive reparations in this country, it's going to be beneficial for a lot of people. In fact, major U.S. corporations have benefited financially from slavery, including the Lehman Brothers, Aetna, JP Morgan Chase, Wachovia, and all of whom released formal apologies in the 2000s. That's the first step, just apologizing for the original sin in this country, which is slavery. We can't even get that. Representative Sheila Jackson Lee from Texas has already put forth legislation that calls for a commission to study this problem, right? How can we talk about who should receive reparations where we can't even agree that, first of all, this is something that should be apologized for, and we should get to the point where we start talking about how can we deal with this? How do we move forward? If we can't even acknowledge that this is something that we need to talk about, we shouldn't even start on the argument of who should receive it.
Yeah, I mean, I think, so a couple of things. One, to clear up something. I think there is no universe in which, and maybe I miscommunicated what I was saying. I don't think white people should benefit from reparations anyway, but I was kind of following along in terms of in my opinion, what makes reparations so difficult is that there are so many nuanced parts of it. If we're saying that anyone who has been negatively impacted by slavery should get reparations, that's one thing. If we're saying anyone who is a descendant of someone who was directly enslaved, that's a different thing. If we're saying anyone who is black in America despite having ancestors that were enslaved in America, that's a third completely different thing. So I think if we're having this conversation, we have to make sure that we're intentional about like who exactly we're talking about. And in that same, universe of questions, and this is just, to put it out there, I think it's important that if we're going to talk about reparations, we have to do so diligently. again, not to say it's impossible, but just to ask these questions, put them out there. We're all, scholars and trying to figure it out. We all care about the future of Black America. And one thing that is on my mind as well is like, where is the money going to come from? So it's like, just to throw one thing out there, and then we can
I think that's definitely a valid point in how we differentiate who's gonna get these reparations. And in my opinion, I think and to go back from the old reference that we always they used to tell us is we get 40 acres and a mule. So I think the people who are direct descendants of those people who were promised 40 acres and a mule, they should receive a direct check. Now, Nigel brought up a great point that racism and slavery affects all Black Americans, and they don't question whether who you came from or what your ancestors were, and we can recognize in this country that there is a vast racial wealth gap in this country among other issues that are directly due to slavery.
Do those people deserve reparations if you're
Black
in America?
And I'm getting there. So I think to address that issue, that we need a tax policy that would redistribute the wealth so that we can, and I don't even know if it's even possible at this point to close the wealth gap, but we definitely need to be working towards closing that. And I think if we do that, that's where we bring in all the Black Americans here in this country today. And we also would be able to address the direct descendants by giving them an actual check, which their ancestors were promised.
I feel like you said something about closing the wealth gap. I feel like that's a separate issue than reparations. I just feel like if we start taxing people and putting that towards reparation, like, okay, my family might be well off, but we're Black, and I feel like I know my family history a little bit, and I do know that some of my direct descendants were slaves. So if people like us are taxed and we're supposed to be receiving reparations, how does that, I don't feel like that goes.
And I think that's valid, but I don't think in a system where we were actually going to make a good effort to redistribute the wealth, I mean, unless your family are billionaires, I don't know that they would be the ones directly taxed. But I think the bigger point is that obviously there's some really great Americans, but it's the idea and the principle behind that the rich and people, or the majority of the billionaires, and most of whom are white, the only reason they have their wealth is because of what they did to our ancestors so many years ago. So the wealth gap is so imperative in this conversation because there wouldn't be one if we wouldn't have had to use our labor, free labor.
Hold on, let me just interject here, because an economist at the University of Illinois said that the cost of slavery, the cost that slaves, if they were alive today, that they should be paid would be $6.5 trillion. And Will raised the point, how are we going to pay for it? Well, let's talk about the things that I brought up previously, not about just Black Americans, but about Black people in the United States of America as a whole, right? What is the cost of slavery today, right? And I can promise you it outweighs the cost of what reparations would be. The findings from Representative Lee's report, nearly 1 million Black people in this country, not just Black Americans, Black people in this country are incarcerated. The unemployment rate of Black Americans is more than twice of white Americans. The average Black family has less than 1/16 the wealth of white families. Now we're talking about the wealth gap. If we can close that, right? If we can do one thing and we get rid of this school to prison pipeline, right? We start investing this money into students being able to go to colleges, being able to go to HBCUs, being able to go to trade schools, right? Sure. We'll put more money into the economy, right? That's gonna be less than, or that's gonna be the benefit from that, right? Is gonna outweigh $6.5 trillion that is owed to Black Americans.
So let's run with that. Let's operate on the assumption that reparations is gonna happen. So now step 2 is how we're gonna do it. How we're gonna close the wealth gap. One thing I think we also have to take into consideration is, do we give a blanket check to all these people, or do we apply a degree of equity as opposed to equality to this? So why would we give a Black real estate agent who makes $5 million a year the same that we give the person struggling, living paycheck to paycheck in a less privileged background? I think if we're going to do reparations, why would we do it in a way that can further create a disparity within the Black community versus having more of an equity approach? I mean, is that something that you guys would agree with?
I personally would agree with that. But to wrap it all up, do you all think that the government should or should not make good on its promise for reparations?
Unequivocally, I think the government should, but I think there's a lot more nuance to it, and I think that it might be more impactful and a more indirect and structural change than a blanket check.
I think that if this country is ever going to claim to be how great it portrays itself to be, and to ever live up to what we said in our Constitution about justice and freedom and rights for all, Absolutely, no questions about it.
Let's face it, the stain of slavery has hurt more than just black Americans, it's hurt black people across the world. I think that the federal government should live up to its promise, and I don't think we have to make it as complex as we've been making it. If you're black, you need to have some sort of reparation because we're repairing something that shouldn't have happened in the first place.
I think that the government should make good on its promise for reparations. However, I think it's incredibly complex. And then I feel like if we start getting into the issue of what Nigel said, if you're black and you should get reparations, I just think that would make it just increasingly complex. So I think it's just almost not feasible, as much as I would love to see it. The debate for reparations has literally continued since the end of slavery. And hopefully, through the 2020 election and more national attention, we can come to some sort of resolution.
So, how do you all feel about reparations? Should the government make good on their promise? And what would that look like to you?
Let us know how you feel about these issues in the comments below.
And if you haven't already and you want to keep up with more politics and current events, follow us on Instagram, Twitter, and subscribe on YouTube.
Thank you for watching. We will see you next time on Political Culture.